Lastly, this phrase also implies that the understanding of a verse, the mafhum, can also be abrogated, even though its explicit wording, the mantuk, remains applicable. Now we learn about another kind of abrogation. So the verse can say, be kind to your neighbor, right? So they're not allowed to change the wording because the wording is the wording. The wording is as it exists. However, later on, somewhere else, Allah said something else. He said, murder your neighbor and rape his wife, right? For argument's sake, right? Steal his sheep, right? Now, even though the wording says be kind to your neighbor, that is the mantuk. That's the explicit wording. The mafhum means steal all his sheep, slaughter them, burn his house down, take all his gold, right? Enslave his children. That is the mafhum, right? So the understanding that be kind to your neighbor, that understanding is not abrogated by other things that have happened in the Quran and the Sunnah. And so even though the explicit wording remains as it is read and understood very differently. This is insanity. Am I reading this correctly? What are your guys' thoughts in the comments? But am I reading this correctly? So even though it says something and apparently means something, it can be understood to mean something completely different. That's mantuk and mafhum, right? A completely different kind of abrogation. So the phrase by ruling means that the nasik ruling, the one that does the abrogating, must also come from Quran or Sunnah, okay? And also, ijtihad, personal reasoning, or qiyas, analogy, cannot abrogate a ruling from the Quran or Sunnah. So the ruling must come from the Quran or the Sunnah, okay? Personal reasoning and analogy cannot abrogate a ruling from the Quran or Sunnah. Okay, fine. Be that as it may. So the wording of a verse remains the same, but the meaning of the verse has changed, and they don't tell us about that. Right. So hopefully I'm understanding and interpreting this correctly. So also I want to make a point that comes up regularly. Yes, it is a mess, Marek. It's a total mess. Do not confuse Salafiyya with Salaf. Right? The phrase that was revealed after it implies that the Mansukh ruling, the ruling that is abrogated, must precede the Nasikh ruling in time. So obviously you something comes later that supersedes something before it, right? So this implies the Nasikh. Okay, so Salafiyya, right, and Salaf are different. Now he speaks of the Salaf and the term Nask. Now people say, well, these are Salafis, right? They speak of the 1950s and Salafis. The Salafis go back to, the Salafis go back to the 17 or 1800s, right? They go back to the 17th century, 18th century. So they go back a significant amount of time. They're not a 1950s phenomenon. Now it should be pointed out that the Salaf did not use the word Nask to refer exclusively to abrogation. They also use the term to apply to specification, takhsis, and initiation, but those are two different concepts. I haven't read those, I haven't covered those, so I don't know exactly what those are, but they're in the book if you want to read it. So the first person to limit the meaning of the word nask to apply to abrogation was Imam Shafi. So Shafi is the one who basically formalized the use of the Sunnah as a legal text to supplement the Quran, and thus he basically codified the approach that is taken between, well, the approach to Islamic law that is followed today. So he was basically the first guy to unite the tradition versus the using reasoning and marriage of the two to understand Islam. So in his famous treatise on Usul al-Fiqh called Al-Risala, now oddly enough, he wrote two books called Risala about 30 years apart, and the first one is effectively defunct. The second one is also technically not in use. It has been built on by other scholars, most famously probably Nawawi, and all the newer Islamic law treatises for the Shafi school of jurisprudence have taken all of Shafi's work, incorporated them, built upon them. So his actual books, while are very simple, very basic actually by comparison, and so but effectively obsolete. So when coming across statements from the scholars of the first three generations that claim that a particular verse was abrogated by another verse, this cannot immediately be taken as an example of Nasik. Now he's referring to the Salaf. The Salaf are the early followers, the first three generations of followers of Muhammad. And they're said to be the truest generation. And after that, Muslims have become diluted, right? So they're no longer as pure as those first followers. So the Salaf and the Salafi and the Salafiyya, those are different things. Salafiyya and Salaf are two different things, right? So this exact factor, which has been one of the greatest causes of confusion with regards to the numbers of Nasik and Mansik verses in the Quran, right? So Nasik at one time meant something different. Under Shafi, I think in the 10th century, it started to mean something a little different. Right, moving on. Now, there are a number of books written on Nask. Let's see, it's a mess. So, is Imam Shafi a Sheikh al-Islam? Yes, Shafi is a Sheikh al-Islam. To my knowledge, yes, he is. Sorry. So, due to the importance of this topic, there have been a great many books written on Nasik and Mansuk verses of the Quran. Okay. So, after the subject of tafsir, the topic that has been given the most attention in the study of the Quran is that of Nask. Tafsir is important, Nask is important, right? Understanding. So, in fact, it is compulsory, it is obligatory for a Qadi, in other words, an Islamic judge, right, a Sheikh, to know about abrogation in the Quran. And this is where this actually conflicts with what Qadi concludes. Yasser Qadi concludes at the end. He says, well, there's maybe one verse, there's maybe 5 verses, there's maybe like just 8. In fact, could be half a dozen. Hell, there could be nothing that's actually been abrogated. There's just a handful. So if there's just 1 or 2, why is it compulsory for someone who studies to become an advanced Sheikh of Islam have to study the subject and have to know which verses abrogate which? It is compulsory for a Sheikh, a judge of Islam, to know what's abrogated and what is not. And they take years to study this. If there's a handful, like 5 verses that are abrogated, then why don't they just give you a freaking A5 page, it's printed, and say, here you go, these are abrogated, let's move on to the next lesson. But they don't. You spend years to study them. So there must be dozens, hundreds that have been abrogated. So one of the first to write a treatise concerning this topic is the famous successor, Qatada as-Sudusi. Some of the more famous authors have written on this topic, who are Ibn Shihab al-Sukhri, Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Ibn Hanbal is very important because he's obviously the founder of one of the schools of jurisprudence, right? He's the guy that read, I think, what did I say, 550,000 hadith, and then made his own collection of 7,500 or whatever. Abu Dawud, of course, from the Kitab al-Sitta, one of the 6 canonical books of hadith. And Tirmidhi, also very, very highly respected scholar and major scholar of both tafsir and as well as, I think, hadith. And both of Sunan fame, yes, both of Sunan. So Sunan, Sunnah, this is a plural of Sunnah. And Ubayd al-Qasim, whose book is considered to be the best classical discussion of the subject. So if anyone wants to go look that up, by all means. Without a doubt, the most thorough discussion of the topic of Nask written in this era is the book An-Nask fi al-Quran by Dr. Mustafa Zaid. In it, the author discusses practically every verse that has ever been claimed to have been abrogated and offers his own conclusions on the validity of each claim. Another excellent work is Al-Ayat al-Mansukha fi al-Quran by Dr.